In the autumn of 1809, in a private room of the Tuileries Palace in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte sat completely still. Not strategizing, not dictating orders, not pacing the way his generals knew him to pace when his mind was working. Just sitting, staring at the wall. His valet constant recorded the moment in his private diary, one of the few documents that survived the burning of imperial archives in 1814. He wrote that the emperor hadn't spoken for 2 hours, that his dinner sat untouched, that when Constant finally asked if he was unwell, Napoleon looked at him with an expression he had never seen on the man's face before. Fear. Not worry. Fear. What Constant didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Napoleon had started having a dream he couldn't stop. The same dream every night for 6 weeks. A figure dressed in white. A voice he recognized but couldn't place. Not a general, not a minister, not Josephine. Someone older, someone that shouldn't have been there. And then nothing. Not darkness, not silence. Just an absence. The kind that felt like a warning rather than an ending. He told no one for weeks. This was Napoleon, the man who had walked into his first major artillery battle at 24 and adjusted the gun angles himself. The man who, during a siege in Egypt, held a lantern over a map while the city burned around him and didn't flinch. He was not a man who admitted to being afraid of his own sleep. But the dreams kept coming. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what kind of man Napoleon actually was by 1809 and what kind of year it had been. He hadn't been born to any of this. He was Corsican, which in 18th century France was barely considered French at all. His classmates at the military academy in Brienne mocked his accent, his poverty, his foreignness. He graduated unremarkably. He spoke French with an Italian lilt his entire life. His full name, the one his mother used, was Napoleon de Bonaparte. He had turned that into the most recognizable name in the world. By 1809 he had shattered the Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had existed for 1,000 years, with 3 signatures. He had defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The kings of Europe wrote him letters asking what they were allowed to do. He had married into the Habsburg dynasty. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful man on earth. And then came Wagram. The battle had technically been a victory. Austria was beaten, the treaty signed, the territory gained, but 37,000 French soldiers were dead or wounded. It was the bloodiest engagement Napoleon had ever commanded. He walked the field afterward alone, which he almost never did, and his chief of staff Berthier wrote that the emperor returned to camp, looking like a man who had seen something that changed him. Josephine still hadn't produced an heir. Whispers had already started that he would have to divorce her. His most trusted marshal, Bernadotte, was becoming dangerously popular. His empire stretched from Spain to Warsaw, which meant it was held together by supply lines so thin that any one of a dozen breaks could unravel everything. For the first time in his life, Napoleon could feel the future slipping. He began looking for answers in places he'd never looked before. He started reading. Not military manuals, he'd memorized those. He pulled from the Imperial Library every text he could find on prophecy, fate, oracles, divination. He summoned scholars of ancient Rome, men who'd studied the Sibylline books, the oracles at Delphi, the auguries of Julius Caesar. He consulted an astrologer named Lenormand, who he dismissed after 20 minutes. He tried a second one. Same result. His private secretary, Meneval, wrote that during this period Napoleon would sometimes stop mid-sentence while dictating correspondence and stare at nothing. That he would cancel meetings without explanation. That he began sleeping with a lamplit, something he had never done before in 30 years of military campaigns. And then, sometime in October, an aide whose name history has mostly forgotten mentioned a name. Lenormand. She had predicted the death of the Tsar's closest advisor, the fall of the Directory, the rise of the consulate. She was wrong about some things, but she was right about enough of them that Paris kept talking. She didn't perform. That was the detail everyone noticed. No dramatic staging, no theatrical robes, no smoke or incense. A plain table, a worn deck of cards. A woman who looked at you the way a doctor looks at a patient, calibrating, not performing. She had the eyes, people said, of someone who was looking slightly past you rather than at you. As if she could see the shape of what was coming attached to your back. Napoleon found her repellent on principle. He was a rationalist. He believed in mathematics, geography, supply lines, and the laws of physics. He did not believe in seers, but he went. He arrived at dusk. Lenormand looked at him for a long moment before she touched a single card. Then she asked him what he was afraid of. Napoleon said nothing. He, who had dictated 40 letters before breakfast. He who could speak for 2 hours without notes on the logistics of a campaign. He sat across from a 50-year-old woman in a room that smelled of candle wax and said nothing. Then he told her about the dream. What she told him that evening, history records and fragments, through Meneval's diary, through Lenormand's own published memoirs, which were heavily redacted before printing, and through an account that surfaced in the 1840s from a man who claimed to be the aide who accompanied Napoleon that night. The accounts conflict on the details. They agree on the shape. She spoke of the East. She spoke of winter. She spoke of a road that leads into something it cannot lead out of. She used the phrase La Grande Armée Inglaudi, the Swallowed Army, which appeared in her published memoir 16 years later, in 1825, 2 years after Napoleon's death on St. Helena. She had no way of knowing, in 1809, what that phrase would come to mean. She spoke of an island, not Elba, a smaller one, further away, a place chosen specifically for remoteness, a place you go when there is nowhere left to run. She told him the empire had a ceiling, and that the ambition to push past it would be the thing that brought everything down. Napoleon stood up before she finished. He told her that men of reason do not negotiate with shadows. He told her that the future belongs to whoever is willing to build it. He walked out without paying. In 1812, he marched into Russia with 680,000 men. He expected 6 weeks. He got 7 months of frost, famine, and catastrophe so total that historians still struggle to describe its scale. The Grande Armée that crossed back over the Niemen River numbered fewer than 93,000. The rest were in the Russian earth, or frozen in the snow along roads that led nowhere. The empire cracked after that. Then it shattered. Austria, Prussia, and Russia united against him for the first time in his career, something he had always prevented through the speed of his victories. The speed was gone. Wagram had cost him something he never got back. By 1814, he was exiled to Elba. By 1815, he was finished at Waterloo, a battle he nearly won, undone by a single miscommunication and an army that arrived 2 hours late. By 1821, he was dying on St. Helena, a volcanic island in the middle of the South Atlantic, chosen by his captors specifically for its remoteness. A place you go when there is nowhere left to run. He spent his final years dictating his memoirs to lost cases, and then to Montholon, reshaping the narrative, constructing the legend, arguing with history about what it owed him. He was still doing it in the weeks before his death. And one evening, somewhere in those final months, his attendant Louis Marchand recorded something Napoleon said quietly, almost to himself, while staring out at the ocean from his window. She was right about everything. The most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is walk into a room where someone is willing to tell him the truth, and then leave before they finish speaking. The consultation on the Rue de Tournon was never officially recorded. Lenormand never named Napoleon explicitly in her published accounts, referring to him only as the man whose destiny had already been decided before he walked through my door. The aide who accompanied him reportedly refused to discuss it for the rest of his life, and Lenormand herself continued operating until 1830, long enough to see the empire fall, the Restoration, and Napoleon's legend begin to overtake his failure. She died at 71 in her parlor on the Rue de Tournon, having outlived the emperor by 9 years. Whatever she saw on the cards that evening in 1809, she never fully disclosed it. Some things, she believed, are better left unfinished, because the man across the table will only walk out before you're done.